Welcome to CoinGeek Conversations, and my guest this week is Sheila Warren, who is head of blockchain, digital currency and data policy at the World Economic Forum. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School and worked on Wall Street before turning to philanthropic enterprises more than 10 years ago. Since then, she's designed and launched NGO Source, which helps philanthropic organizations deal with the legal aspects of international projects more efficiently, and she works for TechSoup, an international network of NGOs that provides technology and technical help for charities. So, what can the World Economic Forum do to help Bitcoin and blockchain make the world a better place? That's what I'm hoping we'll find out. But Sheila, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're listening to CoinGeek Conversations with Charles Miller.
I wanted to start by asking you about some of the practical work that the World Economic Forum does under your leadership, because people might think it's just a question of committees and sitting around and discussing things, which nothing wrong with that, but you actually get out there and are involved in practical projects. You've done the mining and metals blockchain initiative, and more recently, something called the Transparency Project in Colombia, which is really interesting. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that is?
Absolutely. So our Transparency Project was designed to focus on corruption reduction. So looking at anti-corruption measures within the country of Colombia. Everything we build, we take into consideration other geographies as well. But in this case, the pilot was focusing in the country of Colombia. And through a series of workshops there, we established that one of the major places where corruption was rampant was, somewhat disappointingly, in the school food program. So the provision of food, nutrition to school children across the country.
Getting contracts to provide.
That's right.
That
exactly
service,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So we began by really problem scoping. We went in and assessed where was the actual issue. The bidding process was being run by a system, a computer-based system, online system, for this kind of collection of this kind of procurement of information on this kind of procurement model. And what we realized was that there was actually a potential role for blockchain to assist with more transparency in that process, for the purpose of really highlighting areas where there might be corruption, setting off a flag essentially, and ensuring that there was then appropriate accountability for that information. The premise of this project, though, I think is it's really, really interesting, which is, there's a lot of talk in the blockchain space about transparency as if it is in and of itself this good. If things are more transparent, then they are necessarily better. And that is obviously nonsense when it's interrogated even briefly, because certainly if you don't have as an accountability partner any sort of idea what the information that is being made transparent is, if you can't reference the information, if you can't parse it or make sense of it, if it's not downloadable in an accessible format, these kinds of things, then it's really largely a useless exercise. And there's a way of kind of washing, transparency washing, right? Saying, oh, look, everything's available. But as a former lawyer, I know that, data dump is a real thing. And if you can't sift through what's meaningful, it's not actually helpful.
So what kind of authorities were you having to get agreement from in Colombia? Because presumably if they were so happy to take part, then they thought that there wasn't too much of a problem that was going to be solved by this.
Oh, I'd say it was actually quite the opposite. So we had two partners on this. One was the Inter-American Development Bank, who was a core partner on this. They were interested in looking at something in Colombia that could scale across Latin America in line with their interests across the region. And the other was the Inspector General's office in the country of Colombia. So they are basically tasked with doing audits and other things of other government departments to ensure that those departments are adhering to the law and are doing right by citizens, essentially. So we had full support from the government of Colombia.
So most people probably haven't thought about this. I certainly hadn't thought about this before. And one wonderful report I read about it said that you'd used blockchain technology to better understand school meals.
Yeah, I think that's right, basically.
But just see if you can get us one step better than that in understanding actually what was involved. Because how does the blockchain stop corruption in principle?
Yeah, I would say it's not so much, well, a couple of things. So I think that we have to, when we think about corruption, we're talking about human behavior. And there is no technology that is going to change human impulses or even human behavior. We can only shape human behavior. And how do we shape it? We either create carrots or sticks. I mean, this is just basic human psychology. There's nothing that's really different. And what I think is interesting about blockchain is, how do you create those carrots and sticks? How do you construct those incentives? So again, this is where I get back to the idea that transparency in and of itself is not an incentive. Transparency that has accountability built into it. So in this case, the fact that the Inspector General's office, which actually is empowered to go in and root out this corruption and assess, penalties and fines and whatever it might be, criminal penalties in some cases for this kind of activity, that the weight of that was behind this is significant. So that's an important thing to note, number one. Number two, the idea that there are more checks in a system, there's more gating, there are more opportunities to actually spot corruption, is, I think, a deterrent. It does provide deterrent value, and it incentivizes better behavior. Because the idea is, it's easier to get caught. If you do get caught, the consequences are swifter, quicker, and if this is up to Colombian government, they can be even more robust, right? Because you can be more certain that the corruption is actually real.
And those sort of checks are things like using time stamping,
Exactly.
so that people can't change their proposal at a later date.
Exactly. Which was a rampant thing that was happening, right? There'd be a almost mock proposal, if you will, like a straw man submitted, that would then get changed out with corrupt actors, with again, different motivations for that. So the idea here is the immutability of the record provided an opportunity to basically ensure that there wasn't that kind of change happening downstream, or if there was some sort of editing of the change of the record kind of in a new input, you could see that. It would be recorded in a way that was very easy to spot.
Now, if I was somebody who wanted to provide to get this school meals contract, how complicated was it for those people to use this system? It sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah, so that was a key part of this, because there was an existing system, remember. It wasn't built from scratch. There was an existing system called CCOP that was running. And so the idea was to mirror that UX as much as possible, and in some cases to actually hook into that existing system. So use, the certain parts of the rails of it that were actually fine, and not provide too much diversion, both from the standpoint of the user who go in and put in the request to engage in the program, but also on the back end from those staff people within the government who were actually having to learn new processes in order to engage with this. The idea was to take something that had a way of doing it that could be improved. So to some extent, it was looking at systemic change from the standpoint of bringing more opportunity for more actors to have access to the information, adding in the immutability, but it was incremental from the standpoint of a process already existed, and we tried not to mess too much with that, so there wouldn't be this very dramatic, change, which is, again, it's very similar to moving out a legacy system.
But so did the people who are making the bid have to be given some sort of basic instruction, this is what a blockchain is and this is how it works and stuff, or did they just not even have to engage with that aspect?
Yeah, the idea was to keep that as invisible as it could be. So there was some notification just from kind of more of a, FYI sort of, this idea. But the reality is that our whole view is that blockchain, will have made it, will have arrived when it's invisible, and you don't even understand. You don't need to understand what a blockchain is to use really most systems. I would argue, you can buy Bitcoin without understanding anything about how it works.
Right.
So, yeah, similar.
In the report, I thought there was a sort of refreshing honesty in the report where you talk about some of the problems and this little bit. It is also important to note blockchain technology's inability to reduce corruption risk in certain human activities that can occur outside any electronic procurement system, most notably bribery or collusion amongst vendors or between vendors and tenderers. So, I mean,
exactly
that
right.
is it's very honest, but it is rather a major limitation, isn't it?
It is. And I think it's something that we have been very open about from the very beginning of our work, which is to say this is a technology. It's not a silver bullet. You're not actually changing human behavior. Again, you're creating different incentives. You're shaping the path differently You can create new carrots and new sticks, but the fundamental impulses to cheat and lie are going to remain in people that have those impulses. All we can do is try to figure out ways to not just chase and root out that kind of activity, but to stop it because it becomes so costly to do it. The risk becomes so high and the chance of getting caught is so high. But yes, there's a lot of off-chain activity that a chain can never affect because literally the activity is happening off-chain. So you can't really affect a lot of what's going on there.
Right. But you found the results sufficiently encouraging to continue with the project. I mean, how would you say, what would you say you learned from this that you didn't realize before?
Yeah, I think, well, number one, I think the realization of just how persistent corruption really is. Now, that's certainly known, it's not a surprise, but I think for us, not necessarily having deep experience in that particular area, it was quite a revelation. And it's something that I think most people don't really realize just how endemic corruption is and just how comprehensive, I would say is the right word, corruption
Are you
is.
saying then that even with this process in place, the result included some corruption?
I would say that, no, I wouldn't say that. Well, I would say that's almost certainly the case. I would say that's kind of our note that there are so many opportunities in the future procurement system. Now, remember, we were looking at a relatively narrow part of the process. So another area where there was a lot of corruption was in the delivery after the bid was received. We didn't address that at all. So someone might very fairly get the bid, right? And it might be that's all done correctly. The bid goes to the right player. That's all handled in a very upfront manner. And I would say that is what this system engenders. However, when it comes times for delivery on the contract, we're not policing that. So we can prove what was supposed to happen, and all of the indicators are there, what was supposed to happen. But there was one of the reasons we chose this particular project is because a few months prior to our going down for this series of workshops the first time, there was this big expose by an investigative journalist who found that in some cases, the basket of greens delivered to the school had, whatever it was, kale or whatever on the surface layer and rocks underneath to make weight. We can't address that, right? Yeah. So no contract that you have is going to prevent that kind of blatant misuse of, of the system. So again, is there corruption in a school food program that is operating this way? Almost certainly, yes. And a lot of it is something that we did not even attempt to address with this engagement. We were looking at a narrower problem.
Now, you were using the Ethereum blockchain here.
Yeah.
As you know, CoinGeek is a big supporter of Bitcoin SV. Mm-hmm. And one of the advantages of Bitcoin SV is its ability to scale. I'm wondering whether the success of the project did depend on the choice of blockchain and whether it has made you think that is going to be a critical aspect in future, or whether it made you think, well, all blockchains are kind of the same, and so that really wasn't the critical factor.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think opinions on this differ even on the team. I think, for me, I do think that every protocol is different, and it has strengths and weaknesses. I think that is a reality. I think it depends on the lens you're taking it and how closely you're looking. When you step back up, a couple levels, yes, I think fundamentally there's a huge similarity in the way that, most of the major, I would say, blockchain protocols approach design and kind of some of these questions. But those distinctions I do think are important. And I think they are important when you're thinking about legacy systems that you need to engage with. So when you're building from scratch, I'd be more inclined to say, it's a more green field in some ways. When you're looking at connecting into an existing system, I think you then have to examine what are the on-ramps and off-ramps, what are the functionalities that are really needed, how developed is that application layer of that functionality on a particular protocol. Some of this is coincidence. It's where the focus has been of the developers on that protocol. It's not that another one couldn't do it. It's that it wasn't the focus, right? But there is the reality that there's different attention paid on different protocols to different kinds of things. And some of those things are really important for particular use cases. And I would say that is just self-evident and kind of, I would say, incontrovertible.
I think, I think people supporting different protocols agree that there are trade-offs
that
right. You have to make. They just don't agree on which are the most important ones.
Exactly.
Prioritize.
And I think that's where it gets interesting to, put in the vector of the use case. because different use cases have different need. Obviously, I think that's again obvious. And part of what we focus a lot on is problem identification. So we'd start with the problem, and then we figure out what is the right thing. Now, in this particular case, it's a combination of what was actually really needed, the legacy system, these kinds of things that just made from smart contracts functionality, some of these things just be kind of an easier uptake for Ethereum for a variety of reasons. So yeah, but we don't take any position, as I think is widely known, on any of the different protocols. We certainly we think that it's kind of like how I feel about digital currencies. I think that there's room for a variety. I think it's important to have a variety. I actually want to see that for quite some time before if we ever do see like full convergence into one specific protocol. I think it's important to have a time of experimentation and to really stress test different of these trade-offs and stress test them in the real world to see what the consequences are.
Yeah, well, I see that, and one of the other things you do at the World Economic Forum is that you've got a digital currency governance forum.
That's right.
And actually, also this week, the governor of the Bank of England has been talking about the idea of a central bank digital currency. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what your thoughts were about that. Is that, as the World Economic Forum, is that something you would be encouraging or just watching with interest or what?
So again, I certainly think that there is room in the world for multiple instances of a CBDC. Similarly, I think there's room for stablecoin. And similarly, I think there's always going to be room for crypto, called pure crypto, if you will, right? So I think they serve different needs at this time, and they will continue to serve different needs as they are developed and as the attention of those communities begins to focus on particular use cases. So for CBDC, our question, we issued a CBDC policymakers toolkit in Davos this year, I guess, and it feels like it's been a long time. And part of what we tried to walk through was some of the considerations, like give a kind of holistic overview of what should you be thinking about if you're contemplating the launch of a CBDC. What are the pros and cons? Where is it needed? And one of the things that we say pretty explicitly is that you don't necessarily need to have a blockchain-backed CBDC. You could actually do this issuance without a blockchain, and there are reasons why that might be something that is a more easily accessible pilot, for example, or easily accessible experiment. So there are a variety of things where we try to always be very pragmatic in our approach. And I think our general view on both digital currencies and on the technology itself is that of practical optimism. Like, we definitely think that there is a need for this. We also think that there's a tendency still to overhype it. Do most countries need a CBDC? Probably not. Is the world trending towards more digitization of money? Of course, that has hopefully been incredibly obvious for the past decade. So is CBDC the kind of latest example of that? Possibly. Is it, if you're not thinking about CBDC, exploring it, that's not a good thing. Everyone should be thinking about this, and really everyone is, whether they're saying it publicly or not. Who's going to issue first? Probably China. I mean, some of these things are just kind of known, right? So I think the question is, are countries really prepared to not be fully reactive to whatever China does do, but to have a strategy that makes sense to their jurisdiction? And that is where we kind of give the guidance, where we say, make sure you are ready. You understand your citizens' need. You understand your currency. You understand your place in the world economy. You understand your ambitions and goals. Like, make sure your monetary policy, make sure you really thoroughly understand that, because the tendency is going to be, when the big thing happens, whether out of China or wherever else, for everyone else to scramble around and react. And that, in my mind, this is not something you should be doing lightly or quickly or in response. It should be a strategic decision that an economy makes, because there are reasons to kind of move in that direction. Now, at the same time, I think it is important to be forward thinking. And so I certainly know, that most economies, most central banks are quite familiar with the technology, so that when the time comes, when that transition to a blockchain-backed, financial system happens, they're not going to be caught unawares. But is that something to experiment with and put money into and invest in right now? That is a very case-by-case, custom analysis.
I mean, one other dimension of this that could be important is the transnational, thinking of Libra and other projects like that, where your national currency is potentially will have new rivals in these company-owned currencies. I mean, I think I saw you generally making a positive comment about Libra, but do you see that as a good thing, and that we hope that all comes to pass?
I mean, so again, it's I sit in a privileged position because I'm not actually building any of these things, right? Like my role is just to kind of observe and comment on their value as experiments, and I think it's a hugely important experiment. And I'm very excited about seeing what happens with Libra. What is the adoption rate that they think they're going to get because of the backing they have of certain companies and others? Is that a thing that could help us scale to mass adoption, which we have not yet seen? Is that the ticket to doing that? And what could we learn from that adoption model in other areas that maybe have nothing to do with currency?
But when you're talking to governments, I would imagine they're not as enthusiastic about that as you are.
In general, it kind of depends. As usual, I think one's comfort level with a potential rival, depends entirely on how secure one is in oneself. So I would say, for many countries, it's not really a threat necessarily, and they're watching the experiment to see again what they can learn. I think for some countries, it's quite welcome because it might be an option for them to not have to do certain kinds of, builds that they may not necessarily want to do. And I think for some, it is a very real threat. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really, again, it just depends on who you are. I would say there's diversity of opinions in every single economy as well. The politicians might have a different view from the bankers, from the regulators, this kind of thing.
In general, is it more of a threat to the big, strong currencies or the smaller, weaker ones?
It's such an interesting question, right? Because you'd think the answer would be obvious, and it really isn't. And again, the answers vary depending on who you're talking to within a strong or weak currency system, right? So in some cases, the politicians, as a general matter, in the strong countries are opposed because they see it as a political threat to, political soft power and this kind of thing. But sometimes in the weak countries, this is an area where they could actually be an innovator. So they actually see it as a threat because they want their jurisdiction to be the one that is like doing this innovative thing. And, maybe something like this comes across and they don't have the same cachet, whatever. Sometimes it's the reverse. Like in some cases, you've got people that almost say, better this kind of corporate, backed basket kind of situation than whatever we're doing, whatever China's going to do. Maybe China's the bigger threat, So it all depends on your perspective. A lot of this is caught up, of course, in soft power, in currency as sovereignty, like all these kinds of concepts. So it's not, you can't divorce any of this from those considerations. But in my mind, I think that my view is feel what you want to feel about it. There's a reality to this. And the reality is like, they're there, they're doing stuff. So it behooves everyone to pay attention and to glean from that experiment what we can. And in my mind, again, as I've said before, I think that a multitude of experiments is what I'm very excited to see, because I think that we are still, despite what some claim, we are still very much in the learning phase of this technology. Even when it comes to money, which is the original, obviously, application here. But we have a long way to go. So I'm all for it.
As you say, that money was the original application.
Yeah.
But you also put a lot of work into the blockchain side of things,
That's right.
Data and so on. And
supply chain. Mm-hmm.
Supply chain. You had something, a group of experts in the Global Blockchain Council who were working on something that was at one point called the Blockchain Bill of Rights, I think.
Yes.
It's now
Some still call it that. Some still insist on calling it that.
It's also called the Presidio Principles. And I just wanted to ask you a bit about that. So just for people who haven't come across this, it's basically a statement of guidelines that block good practice in blockchain development. And it's things like this, that users should be able to grant or deny permission for their data to be accessed, manipulated, or destroyed in its entirety. So things that you would hope that entrepreneurs will sign up to, and then they get a sort of stamp of approval. Is that right?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's so much a stamp of approval. It's kind of a self-certification in a sense, right? And I should note that the Presidio Principles are aspirational in nature. So there's 16 principles, and we don't actually think that most applications would currently meet all 16. They're meant to be a bit of a North Star. Like, what is the direction we should be moving? And the real impetus behind this. So I'll back up a bit. So the Global Blockchain Council is comprised of people with very, very strong opinions that cover the spectrum. Bitcoin maximalists to skeptics about blockchain to begin with, people who are not even convinced it has legs. And then we've got enterprises, governments, others, startups, others in here, some funders, et cetera, VC. So the idea was, how do we create, and the immediate notion of this group when we first met was, this is something that's missing. Like, there's something like this that is missing. And part of what is happening, or what happened particularly during ICOs, the ICO craze, was that we saw really fake projects that didn't leverage the blockchain in any meaningful way. Like, no characteristics of blockchain were relevant to the project. They just kind of shoved the name in there and moved on. And so how do we guard against that happening again? Because certainly we're going to enter, I think all of us who are bullish on the space agree there'll be another hype cycle phase that comes up at some point, et cetera, as people really understand the real root of the technology and what it can do. And as we start seeing more proof of that in the world, in real use cases. So how do we then say, if you're not actually leveraging the blockchain, then you should first of all, you should really stop and think about whether you need to be building on a blockchain, like hooking into a protocol, or whether you can build your thing, in some other way. And secondly, you really shouldn't be using that to market your application. So it's focused at the application layer. It's specifically not focused on the protocol layer. It's the application layer. And the idea is to really say, here are principles that we think should be used as gating as part of in your design sprints or whatever it might be, or for your funders, your criteria for your portfolio companies. Just think about these things regularly. And if you're not meeting them, we're not saying that's bad. We're saying there needs to be a good reason why you are claiming to be a blockchain-backed application if you're not meeting these.
And one question that struck me when I was reading those principles is that it would be great if you could get a lot of internet companies to adopt them, because
That's true.
Some of the promise of blockchain is to liberate us from surveillance capitalism, where our data is used often without our knowledge, sometimes even without our permission. And are you optimistic about the prospects for that? And how much do you think that is going to depend on people's awareness of these issues? Because to some extent it will. If nobody cares, then business as usual will carry on.
That is such a great question. Am I optimistic about it? No. I would not say I'm optimistic about it. I'll just answer that question bluntly. However, that does not mean I don't think it is very much worth paying attention to and even fighting for. And the reason I'm not optimistic is because, despite the attention paid to things like facial recognition and other things this pandemic has brought about, right, there's more understanding and a sort of response to say, hey, it's not okay. And despite even the movement towards, freeing our data, like free data, all that kind of thing, right? There's no question those movements have momentum and they're very important. I think I just see a little more what happens behind the scenes, and not just by companies who are often the bad guy, but by governments, and the way that data is, the sheer volume and flow of that data. And so I am skeptical that tide can be appropriately stemmed. What I think we can do, and so I also lead the data policy team here at the forum, what I think we can do is start to articulate what are appropriate uses for that data. So not so much that we're stemming the tide of flow, because it's just very, very hard to do that. And not just that we're saying X kind of data, PII, that data can never be shared, because it just doesn't make sense. Like, there are cases where I don't care about my PII, and there are cases where other data is more sensitive to me, right? I actually care far more about other kinds of things than I do about some arbitrarily defined sort of, data. Now, I don't mean to say that the whole concept should be thrown out, but I think that there is definitely an overemphasis on the notion that you can classify data and say that this kind of data should always be private, this data should never be private. It just doesn't really make sense to me.
Isn't that part of the promise of blockchain, that you will own your data, exactly, and you can say yes to this part, no, nobody can, this person can look at this bit and this person can look at that bit?
Yes. So
but you're saying there's not really a desire for that.
That's what I'm saying. I don't necessarily feel like the vast majority of people really care. And the reason I feel that way is because I've seen, I think we've all seen how quickly people are willing to sign away their rights, for not just in, the pandemic is often used, and that's an extreme example, which is a general matter. I'm a lawyer, right? When I'm in a rush, I will still click on whatever acceptance to get what I need to get to go where I need to go. And I am one of the more highly educated people on the consequences of doing that. Now, I, unlike most, will go back and then amend the, thing later. But like the damage has already been done, right? Like I've already sent it's in the stream. So you got to do it at the very beginning. Going back and editing it later doesn't really make, that's not how it works. So I think that, and I just know that from just even anecdotally, people just don't do that. They say they care, but their actions speak a lot louder than their words.
Yeah.
So all that is a long-winded way of saying, until I think there is some actually enforceable regulation in this area and more accountability that comes from an authority that is actually considered scary by those who seek to kind of abuse this free flow of data, I think we're going to be in the same situation that we are currently in, despite the fact that we do have a technology that every day gets closer to helping us create a better system. So I guess I'll end that kind of dark analysis by saying that that's really kind of a short to medium term pessimism. I do think in the long term, clearer minds will prevail. I think that there is a generation coming up that thinks this way by default, right? Like that is oriented to this. And so the things that they build, the things that we're seeing kind of come up are not entrenched in older notions of how, data should be treated. And so I think we're going to see a lot more openness and not even demand for these kinds of systems. So when I think about the blockchain and data kind of space, I think that's like a 10 years out, 20 years out, kind of thing where we see a cultural transformation that allows us to really take advantage of the elements of the blockchain that make this possible to do this in a different and better way. But we're going to be mired in this thing for a while. I think that's what I think.
Yeah. Well, Sheila, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting and fantastic that you are doing this work out in the field. And it seems to me that if we're going to get to that more optimistic place that you're talking about, it'll be because you've demonstrated things that are practically useful for people and that they work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And our goal really is to normalize this technology and take away any fear around it and get people to understand that really it's like any other technology. It's got significant benefits and new benefits. It also has some challenges, and those are being addressed. But our hope is that over time, people will stop talking about blockchain. They'll just be using it without even knowing.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye now.
Bye.
Many thanks to Sheila Warren of the World Economic Forum. Well, this is in fact the 26th and final episode in Series 3 of CoinGeek Conversations. It started back in January this year, in those happy days when you could shake hands and hug strangers without a second thought. We'll be back with a new series in September, but don't go away, because until then, every week my colleague Natalie Mason will be introducing some of our greatest hits from the CoinGeek Conversations archive. So do please listen out for them. But from me, Charles Miller, thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to bringing you another collection of amazing speakers in September. Bye for now.